Welcome, everybody. I've had a nice break, and it's good to see so many faces back. It's my great pleasure to introduce to you today Dr. Jean Boulton, who is a visiting fellow with the Department of Social and Policy Studies at the University of Bath and also with Cranfield University. She has a PhD in quantum physics and is a fellow of the Institute of Physics. The focus of her work for many years has been in the field of complexity theory, following the tradition of Prigogine, and she is the author of Embracing Complexity. She has a particular interest in the ontological implications of complexity and in exploring the utility and validity of these ideas for the social and natural world. She teaches complexity thinking in several universities and institutions, as well as undertaking consultancy assignments in the field of strategic and thinking and policy. She was a research fellow with the Stellenbosch Institute for Advanced Studies in 2019, out of which the thinking for this talk has emerged. So kudos to Stellenbosch. In this talk, she aims to articulate the ontology underpinning complexity theory, taking as its foundation Prigogine's focus on the thermodynamics of open systems and framing becoming as the emerging, stabilizing, and ultimate dissolving of patterns of relationships. She will show how it can deepen into a more processual turn in complexity thinking. The talk will further explore how the particular nature of process complexity is very resonant with Daoism and process philosophy more generally, and also remarkably in tune with insights from quantum gravity. She will then draw out some of the implications of this processual turn, in particular the essential indeterminacy of nature and the link between contextual particularity, reflectivity, and the emergence of novelty. Finally, she will suggest some implications for practice and reflect on the dance between inner and outer complexity. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Jean. Thank you very much, Jean, and I'm very much looking forward to this contribution.
Yes, thank you, Anton. Yes, it sounds like a lot to do in half an hour, doesn't it? But we shall see. Let me just share my my slides with you. So I wanted to say a little bit about where I'm coming from in this. So as Anton said, I'm originally a physicist. I studied quantum physics. I've been involved in complexity theory since the mid-1990s. And in particular, I followed the tradition of Iscia Prigogine, who for many was one of the key fathers of complexity thinking. And I want to explain that particular kind of lineage into complexity. And that really is also involved in this book, which we wrote in 2015, together with Peter Allen, who worked with Prigogine in Belgium for many years, and before moving to Cranfield School of Management. So he's also a theoretical physicist. So I want to explain that journey that took me to that book in 2015. And then I want to talk a little bit more about what I've called process complexity. So where you can kind of soften some of the kind of realist assumptions that underpin complexity in order to make it more tractable and computational. And I want to look at its resonance, which has interested me for a long time with the philosophies from the 5th century BC, from the so-called actual age, particularly Daoism, but also this more recent work in quantum gravity and cosmology, and also process philosophy more generally. So I feel entranced by this kind of resonance between how can it be that people in the 5th century BC, through being immersed in a complex and flowing and an emerging world, who used as their method a kind of radical empiricism, an immersion in the world, come to such similar conclusions as we've come to with the most sophisticated of physics. I find that thoroughly entrancing. And I remember Peter Allen coming back to Cranfield one day, clutching a copy of the Tao Te Ching, in fact, this copy of the Tao Te Ching on Daoism, saying, look at this, Jean, the introduction reads just like a complexity theory textbook. So I want to explain a bit about that. I then want to talk about this kind of almost metaphysical idea of ontological indeterminism, that the fact that things aren't difficult to know because they're complicated, but that there's something intrinsic about indeterminism in the nature of reality, of the universe itself, in the minutiae and the very fabric of the universe has this kind of indeterminism built within it, which has glimmers of quantum physics in that statement, as well as thermodynamics. Then a very little bit on implications for practice. And I finally wanted to say just a little bit about the issues between, in a sense, inner and outer complexity, because in this series of talks, many of them have really reflected more on what can we say about the inner nature of complexity. How does our history and context shape the way we think about and engage with the outer world? So I want to say something about how I think this more science, this particular tradition in complexity kind of meets that question of inner and outer. So let me start with Iscia Prigogine, a Russian-born Belgian. He worked in Brussels for his career. He was a physical chemist, and he talks in his autobiography. He got the Nobel Prize for this work in 1977. And he said he was intrigued from being a young man by reading Bergson's book on creative evolution, and in particular by this statement in that book, why does life mount the incline that matter descends? So what we're talking about here is the recognition that in evolution, in life, things have a tendency to complexify. We move from the amoeba to man. There's a kind of movement to increasing complexification, increasing sophistication, increasing order, if you want to use that word. Whereas what physics has basically two sorts of theories in its classical sense. One is the machine view, that things go on without changing forever like a machine. There's no novelty, there's no change, everything's determined. And then this other view that comes from so-called equilibrium thermodynamics, which is about heat dissipation, the loss of information and structure, which is about the increase of entropy and the fact that in the end things resolve into flat energy or featureless dust. So why do these two things not come together? And as well as being intrigued by Bergson's work on evolution, he was also struck by some experiments going on in Russia in the 1950s by Belozov and Sabotinsky. Before this work was published, because Prigogine was Russian, he was obviously able to read these papers. And these reactions were happening in a petri dish with a certain combination of chemicals. And these patterns, as I'm showing in these pictures here, kind of emerged, dissolved, turned into new patterns. And people thought it was a mistake. Nobody took them seriously to start off with, because there didn't seem to be any explanation of why you get these patterns emerging on levels that were way beyond the molecular level. And what Prigogine got the Nobel Prize for was in a sense one word, and that was to recognize that with open systems, situations that could exchange information and energy with their wider context, then you can get a decrease of entropy locally. Order can emerge locally energized by the energy and the information exchange with the wider context. So he showed that these, for open systems, new patterns can emerge and new characteristics can emerge that are shaped by the particularities of the situation and its history in a dynamic fashion. So this was the beginning of complexity theory. So I want to just summarize before I move on, just you know, in this tradition, or in my reading of this tradition, what do we say are the conditions for complexity? First of all, that situations are open to their wider context, as I've just been saying. So I tend to shy away from the word system because it can make it a kind of reification, a kind of thing that exists with boundaries. But we're really talking, for example, as you look in this picture here, we have a river flowing through a valley. It's a situation working on different timescales. The valley's being caused by the erosion by the water through the mountains over time. There's a reflexive connection between that the mountains shape the water and the water shape the mountain. The trees have grown up on a slightly on a shorter time scale. They can have their roots eroded by the water. A tree can fall in to the river and change the patterning of those swirls and whirlpools that we can see in that picture. So there's a picture of things being interconnected reflexively. Relations between them are interwoven with the possibility of feedback in the way that I've described, that the water erodes the tree roots, the tree falls in, that changes the water. And we have a variety of timescales here. We have the mountains being eroded to create a valley. We can have rain happen just now, particularly if this is in the UK, where those patterns would change. And those patterns are interweaving and reflecting each other. If you sit by a river and watch the water come down, it can often be reflected off the banks of the river. That can interfere with what's coming down. It can form standing waves and relative stability. So we've got this picture of patterning, of patterns of relationships that exist, that are real, but can morph and change into something else on a different timescale, that are interwoven and interconnected. The patterning of the trees and the ecology on the bank will impact the river. We've got all this in a kind of variation, messy diversity change, but out of which can come, as in Prigogine's patterns on the Petri dishes, things can stabilize, and we can regard them as existing, at least for now, and constituted by the relationships that form them. So this is a kind of core idea within complexity theory. So this is where we got to in 2015, or when the book was published, and a phrase in that book that's being quoted, I would say off quoted, but certainly quoted more than any other phrase in the book, is this idea of a dance between patterns and events. So we have patterns emerging. We know about those kind of things in cultures, in the way a particular town or community operates, in the way the norms in organizations, in ecologies. In my local wood, there are certain relationships between patterns and flora and fauna that exist there. Up the wood a bit further away, there's a completely different, there are bluebells in the wood further away. I don't have bluebells in my wood, it's wild garlic that's taken over. Those things, those patterns of relationships emerge, are held in place to some extent by the interweaving of those ecological relationships, and then can dissolve into something else. So Peter Allen made this particular point that we have patterns, and then we are interested in how those patterns are disturbed by events, chance, deliberate action, variation, shock, shifting alliances, changing in the wider context. So we have a kind of from being to becoming. We have a view of the emerging dynamic future as systemic and patterns, sensitive to context and history, dynamic, episodic, emergent, and non-deterministic. And I'm not going to say very much more about that at this stage, other than understanding that sometimes systems thinking can focus a lot on what are the current patterns of relationships. Complex systems thinking is very much interested in this dynamic. It's always seeing things as temporary. Albeit sometimes those scales can be quite long and things can get locked in. So I'm really interested in the fact that this primacy of patterns was kind of commented on right back to Leibniz in 1715. There's a lovely book of a correspondence between Leibniz and Clarke, who was a contemporary of Newton, and an argument between Leibniz and Newton, and Leibniz pointing out to Newton that whilst you maybe understand the forces in this mechanical universe, and obviously that took us a huge step forward, it tells you nothing about the particularity of the universe. Why is there a galaxy here and not there? Why is the solar system got these planets in and not any other planets? And he was really looking at that patterning and making comments that Newton's theories had nothing to say about that patterning right back at the beginning of these kind of theories. And as Lee Smolin, a cosmologist who I love the way he writes about these things, says the fact that we live in a universe of structures at so many scales is so commonplace, so manifest, that it's easy to miss its significance. So traditional physics theories, other than thermodynamics and quantum gravity is moving into this field as well. But if you take the classical theories of physics, electromagnetism, gravity, and so on, they can tell you in a sense about how things interact, but they don't give you any theory about the beginning of things, the end of things, the flow, and why there is this kind of particularity. And it's something, as Smolin says, it's almost easy to miss. There's also, and you can see that part of what I'm trying to talk about here is the resonance of these ideas in very different traditions. So in Buddhism and Daoism, these kind of actual age, 5th century BC ideas, that this idea of patterns being constituted by relationships and something that can move is very inherent in Buddhism and Daoism, and indeed in some of Hinduism. And this particular phrase at the top of this page, the Dalai Lama, who I went to listen to in 2008 in Nottingham with the translator, was explaining a particular Buddhist text and said this: there is no self-defining discrete reality to cause or effect. Forms or feelings are devoid of inherent existence. It is only on the basis of aggregation of subtle elements that forms exist. Forms can only be understood in relational terms to their constitutive elements. So that's wonderful to me that these ideas are resonating with very different traditions. So let me take this a step further now into what I've become to call process complexity. And it's really emphasizing that although in traditional complexity theory, there's a kind of working assumption that things are connected by forces which can lead to patterns, the emphasis on things is just really a computational convenience or something we're used to in a kind of materialist, reified world. It wasn't really in Prigogine's original thinking in those kind of patternings that emerged in the Belousov-Zhabotinsky reaction. It's not necessary. It's just if you want to, if you want to do computational complexity, we often want to think about things connected by forces. Or people connected by it suits us to think that way, but we can take a much more what you would call a field theory perspective, where things can be considered more like ripples or waves or whirlpools on a river they're distinguishable, but they can interpenetrate, sustain for different timescales, are impacted by context history and are in flow. So there's no separation really between what is a thing and what is a force. When you think of ripples impacting each other, moving through each other, that we don't need to think about things and forces. And that's the same in field theories generally, in electromagnetism, in quantum field theory, etc. It's not a big step for physics to think in this more diffuse way. And also in this perspective then of interpenetrating patterns, there's also no separation really between what is a pattern and what is an event. So we're going back to my diagram here, where I've distinguished patterns and disturbances to patterns. Obviously, I can think about an event as being a small pattern or indeed a large pattern. So it may be that the large emerging social change, universal social change and economic changes that have been brought about by the pandemic will impact the patterning of our lives, the patternings of how we do education, for example. So we can see things as patterns, long or short, big or small, interpenetrating. So we start to have this more kind of oneness rather than a dualism in this theory. So the ontology of complexity becomes processual. And it adds a kind of flavour to that. It's a focus on the minutiae of detail and how that can lead to wholes forming and dissolving. So it's not a kind of bland, oh, well, look, everything's in flow. It's an interest in how can we understand where things emerge from, what creates the conditions, the minutiae that weave together the broad-based history, the broad-based context, with the particularity of why is this swirl in the Belousov-Zhabotinsky interaction here and not there? Why did it start now and not then? That focus on the minutiae of detail. So that's what I'm calling process complexity. And again, in this interest of resonances, I was delighted to find that Carlo Rovelli, who writes a lot about quantum gravity, is a theoretical physicist, a proper one, not like me, a lapsed one, says the world is made up of events, not things. Even the things that are most thing-like are nothing more than long events. So we are long events. The world is not so much made of stones as of fleeting sounds or waves moving through the sea. So a very similar kind of ontological image to the one I'm talking about. Similarly, in my preferred interpretation of Daoism, the Dao De Jing by Ames and Hall, particular things are in fact processual events and are thus intrinsically related to other things. These processual events are porous, flowing into each other in the ongoing transformation we call experience. Similar kind of idea from Hinduism. So there's real resonances. I feel that in this kind of ontological stance of process complexity, the fact that there's a kind of resonance with other ontologies coming from very different directions, I find really interesting. So moving on again, and I can see time ticking by here. I'm very interested in the kind of ontological implications of complexity. It's often viewed as a kind of epistemological project, as a kind of, you know, how do we know about things? I think it's very interesting to reflect on what does it mean about the nature of things. It's a sort of metaphysical kind of exploration for me. And there's something very central to complexity thinking about indeterminism. So irreversibility, this idea that comes from thermodynamics, time's arrow, path dependence, that the past shapes but does not determine the present. Something Stuart Kaufman, a complexity thinker, called non-ergodicity, the fact that things do not visit all possible states. So if there's more possibilities than actualities, then what the possibilities that are lost is a sort of loss of information. So we can't go back to, when we've chosen this path, we can't go back to choosing a path that we haven't chosen, or if we do, we've already changed things before we make that choice. So indeterminism, irreducibility, complexity is not analytically tractable, a point made very well by Edgar Morin, who talks about the restrictive complexity, the kind that you can compute to a degree, but the core of complexity is really not predictable, not knowable, not analytically tractable, and there's an intrinsic paradox within it, and I don't have time here to go into this, but the kind of core of quantum physics, which if you move right down to the kind of the most minuscule explanations of things, is saying the world cannot be entirely determined at the very core. And in fact, if it didn't say that, we wouldn't be able to understand or even consider things like the beginnings of things, like the beginning of the universe. And yeah, I need to stop myself saying more about quantum physics there. It's not really about the uncertainty principle in quantum physics, which is particularly predictable. It's about this idea of the collapse of the wave function and the fact that we can't always know, out of all the possible things, what's going to happen. So this ontological indeterminism leads on to emergence, changes in the realms of possibility, novelty, which could not have been predicted. So there's something very central for me about ontological indeterminism. And I found this by William James, who was very inspired by Darwin and evolutionary thinking. And he said it all in 1884. What does determinism profess? I love the way this is written. Those parts of the universe already laid down absolutely appoint and decree what the other parts shall be. The future has no ambiguous possibilities hidden in its womb, etc. It wells with the rest into an absolute unity, an iron block in which there can be no equivocation or shadow of turning. I do wish I could write like this. Indeterminism, on the contrary, says the parts have a certain amount of loose play. It admits that possibilities may be in excess of actualities, and things may in themselves be ambiguous, this sort of paradoxical quality. Of two alternative futures, both may now really be possible. The one that becomes impossible only at the very moment when the other excludes itself by becoming real. So he has even at that point this idea of non-ergodicity about what's left when we make, or when not also when we make choices, but when things happen in the universe that then precludes other things from happening. Similar ideas in Daoism. I'm speeding up slightly now. And that it is this indeterminism that allows emergence. So Stuart Kauffman said, for example, in this scientific worldview, we live in an emergent universe of ceaseless creativity in which life, agency, meaning, consciousness, and ethics have emerged. Our entire historical development has been self-consistent, co-constructing, evolving, emergent, and unpredictable. So it's got this this quality that it is the very indeterminism that allows for this flow of creativity, of newness, of novelty, and of particularity, about the importance of the path that is taken, which doesn't determine the future, but it does shape it. So very briefly, I could say an awful lot about implications for practice, and I'm picking out a few themes here. One theme that was picked up by Paul Cilliers at the University of Stellenbosch in particular, is the point that if things are indeterminate, then everything is a choice. What explanations to have, what information to focus on, how to act, what science to regard as important, who to listen to. Everything is an ethical choice. So I feel that I feel that is a very important point to make. another point to do with indeterminism is that for open social systems, there's a sort of sense in which everything's paradoxical. So what is the best way to raise a child? Should we focus more on individualism, or should we focus on collectivism? How do we balance the short term with the long term? Most questions of interest in the social and indeed natural world don't have easy answers. They don't have answers. We have to kind of move into those answers. We have to try things out and see. We have to take multiple perspectives. We have to know that there's a kind of humility about that process, because as we take one path, it will have some impacts, and we may want to come back and steer around. So it kind of puts paradox centrally into our teaching of managers and policymakers. One of the things that, again, I can point you to, but haven't time to talk about here, is the importance of looking at context dynamically. Understanding that the past inhabits the present. Can we understand, by thinking more about the past, what is really deeply embedded in our situation, in our organisation, our market, our culture? How does the past show up? And how do we think about the future? How we think about the future it impacts the present too. So we have to think dynamically about things. Much more to say about that. I just want to say a little bit. I'm going to leave the third point and talk about the importance of paying attention to the minutiae of change. This is a really interesting area that some complexity people I know are really focusing on this. It really emerged in many ways out of the work of Brian Goodwin, who was very interested in a Goethean approach to science back in the 1990s. But it's something about how it's good to analyse what's stable in terms of this idea of patterning, but we need to observe what is emerging. We need to catch it early. If we wait till things are certain, we've lost this kind of emerging out of the inchoate, as Ames and Hall say, and the seemingly insignificant phases. If we can catch things as they're emerging, perhaps we can nudge them, perhaps we can shape them, or indeed do the opposite. But how do we really create change? How do we pay attention to these kind of minute emergence of change, and not in some kind of rational way wait until they're more objective and so on before we actually start to work with them? So I find that an interesting and developing theme for myself. I just wanted to show you, given where I'm talking, that this is a slide I use very often, and I've used Nelson Mandela many times since going to Robben Island 20 years ago, and being so struck by the idea that how would you know for 22 years or 26 years as you sat in a cell, as you did hard labour, how could you feel that the integrity of your ethics was something to hang on to? How could you ever know that would have agency? You know, how do we seed the system with good ingredients? How do we believe in the integrity of our values and intentions? It's that enters the system, and it's interesting to think about where. No, I won't even think about that because I'm running out of time. So I was thinking about more recent politicians and the issue of integrity, and how that seeds the system and how that changes the dynamic. So I use Nelson Mandela as an example of how he could never have known, as he stayed with those ideas and his own ethical stance, that he would become in a position to really make such a big transition as he did. The final thing I want to say is, and it's really partly as a response to some of the talks I've heard in this series of talks, is about how does this form of complexity theory, this kind of Prigogine informed process complexity, think about inner and outer. And I guess it's not seeing them as different in a sense. The inner and the outer world, the way we think and imagine things has agency in the outer world, and the outer world affects the way we think and imagine things, and the patterning of our thoughts and the historical context of how our upbringing and experiences shape the way the patterning in our own inner world. There's a kind of co-evolution of the inner and the outer, in a sense, and Prigogine picked this up and talked about, you know, the anticipation of the future contributes to the present. So I would say that complexity theory more generally has tended to focus on the outer and sees the inner as acting on it. Byrne has picked this up. It's not to ignore the inner, but it's to see it as one of the agents that acts on the outer. But there's a oneness implicit in process complexity, which I think removes that distinction. And just to throw in a one-liner, something else I'm thinking about at the moment is the emphasis on indeterminism, even at the very fabric of the new universe. So quantum physics takes us down to even at the smallest scales. We can't pin down what's going to happen. It makes room for mystery, and maybe even a glimmer of panpsychism that maybe consciousness didn't so much emerge as in some form was there in the very interstices of the nature of reality. So process complexity positions complexity as a processual ontology and moves beyond the distinctions of things, forces, patterns, and events. It emphasizes indeterminism and uncertainty as ontological as metaphysical. And when I say uncertainty, I don't mean we know nothing, everything's in chaos, but I mean that we can't entirely pin down what's likely to emerge in the future. Complexity is defined in this tradition as the emerging, stabilising and dissolving of empty patterns that are engaging with each other. The inner and the outer, I'm suggesting, can be viewed as co-evolving, historically and contextually shaped, emerging dynamic patterns. So thank you very much, everyone. I have a paper that's been accepted for publication that this talk is based on, and I'm happy to share a preprint if anyone wants to email me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean. That was incredible. A lot of information to process there, but I want to open it up to the floor. Are there any questions, any comments that you'd like to put Jean's way? Andrea?
I feel guilty jumping in right from the start, but one of the things that caught my attention, well, there are a couple of things, but just this first thing, and that would be this idea of catching it early. I mean, it's fascinating, but if you were to catch it early, then you would be catching it before it becomes what it is. So then you've already changed it while you're catching it, and then you get yourself into a little bit of a paradoxical situation because it will not become itself if you catch it. I don't know if that's a good or bad thing.
Yes, it's you're right, but what we are not predisposed to do, and I'm thinking about managers and leaders in this, is there's a tendency in our rational world to say, let's wait till we really know about things. So to give you an example, I did a piece of work a number of years ago in Kenya, in Northeast Africa generally, where there was a kind of discussion about why the drought that was called in 2011, I think it was not called early enough. And the issue seemed to be that people were waiting for concrete evidence. And by the time you waited for the concrete evidence, it was too late. But if you worked with more subjective signals, which often came through people being more embedded in the culture, having relationships with people, listening to people who live there, you know, working more with a kind of subjective criticality, you know, taking multiple perspectives, taking vast range of information, both qualitative and quantitative, you could start to say something is happening here. We do feel there's something coming out of here that wasn't, you know, we don't have to just wait till all the cattle are dead before we say it's a drought. So it's that. Also, if you're working with groups, if you're trying to create change, if you're working, say, with a board or with a group of managers, can you sensitize people to maybe some glimmer of a change in dialogue? You know, some glimmer of a dissolving. It's that. Now, you're quite right. Then if you start going, oh, that's dissolving, you have impacted it. But there is something about the nature of changes that sometimes that's what we want to do. We want to be able to nudge. We want to say, look, do you feel something new in the air here? You know, how is that something we want? How do we support that? So it becomes a kind of change process to focus on nudging, encouraging, you know, naming as kind of qualitative things. But in, you know, you are right that to notice what's emerging will change what's emerging. So it's a good point.
Great.
Thanks. Anton, before you carry on, I'm not sure if you're seeing hands raising. I'm not sure if it's in mine, but there's.
I am, yes.
Excellent.
Yes, I think we have got Nehemiah as next.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I'm Nehemiah. I'm a current PhD candidate in what many would perceive as the ugly stepsister of physics, chemistry, the more fleshier one. So my question arises from I've been a part of a group that kind of emanated from these discussions, and particularly looking at race. Right, and how complex thinking factors or finds its way into race. And as I've been engaging in these talks and going over these, something that has been sticking out to me is this concept of multiple truths, right? If we have to read multiple truths.
Multiple traits.
Truths. If we look at in the context of physics, if we look at the theories around the multi-universe, you know, Schrodinger's cat, if you will, you know, and how that factors into kind of our thinking that we currently have, our systems that we have, where the systems are very rigid. Like you say, by the time we figure out that cows are dying, it's too late to respond to the cause of that. And I think it really calls for thinking around the valley, the image of the valley that you were showing. How do we transfer thinking into that space? How does thinking become more fluid in that sense? Because, and I think it plays on the concept of being a professional some way, right? How do we as professionals learn to step back and say that with the truth that I have currently, I'm implementing certain systems. However, I should always be aware that I might need to step back with new information, right? I don't essentially have all of the information to tackle what we are dealing with, but as information comes, I add. So kind of thinking about this fluid process, and is that possible in systematic thinking? Is that possible when we're trying to construct change? Is that possible when we're trying to govern, in a sense? So my thinking is a bit erratic, but that's kind of what I was thinking about when you were talking.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've said a lot to try and respond to, but one of my projects in a sense is to kind of emphasize to policymakers that it's not like we may have new information, but things are not knowable. There is no answer to many things. We have to have adaptive policies. We have to try things out and see whether they work. We have to take multiple perspectives. it's not, yeah, it's trying to say to people, there's never a systematic answer. That's not to say we just, you know, meditate and hope for the best, or adapt to what emerges, but there's a both and. There's a kind of paradoxical quality that this is calling out to us, which is we do our best to analyze the information we have, and we know that there's something that will emerge that we haven't thought of. There's a lovely quote by complexity theorists which says, please make a list of all the things that have not yet occurred to you. And you could say, please make a list of all the things that haven't yet happened, that we've got no indication that might happen. So we have to, part of our project in this is to re-educate people. That complexity doesn't mean, oh, it's all very complicated, we know nothing. It means we have to search for the patternings that exist and be alert to emerging shoots of change at the same time. Take a critically subjective view, bring in multiple perspectives, do our best to plan what we should do next, review often, and adapt to changing circumstances. So it's a kind of, I feel, of all the things that I do and say, trying to shift people's ontological stance is probably, you know, even getting people to think about this kind of idea of an ontological stance and what this might offer is really, really important, because otherwise what people do with complexity is they try and simplify it, they try and control it, they have very sophisticated methods of reducing it, and that's not necessarily bad, but it's within a mindset that you know, we can get to the bottom of it, and there is an answer if we only work hard enough. So it's I hope that it's you said a lot, Nehemiah, and it was very interesting. I hope that that helps to respond to what you said.
Well, thank you very much.
Great, thank you. I think Janet has got a question next.
Yeah, Jean, thank you so much. I found it really fascinating. I really like the idea of process complexity as you described it. And I'm in the Department of Development Studies, and I'm involved with what you call adaptive policymaking, but it's really testing out things in terms of water, food, energy, housing, you know, these kinds of basic needs. But what I found interesting, and what I wanted to question you about, was in the beginning, where you talked about patterns and the primacy of patterns. And I'm wanting to know, do you accord, or does this theory accord the same status to patterns in nature and to patterns in human behavior? So you talked about institutions and cultures and economies in the same way as you talk about the galaxy or the ecology. And I don't see, I mean, I'm philosophically a materialist, but I don't see how you can give the same status to the patterns in human behavior as the patterns in nature. Thanks.
Yes. So yeah, that's so I've just been involved in writing a book chapter for a book that's just been published on social ecological patterns, and the point is, you can't. This is a kind of idea that you can't really separate these things, you know. So one of the things I didn't talk about, for example, is sometimes people talk about coupled policies. So they have a kind of economic policy and they have an environmental policy. So if you're talking about, you know, should we have another runway, which has been an ongoing talk for one of the London airports, you'll have an economic argument and policy, and you'll have an environmental argument and policy, and they then kind of fight each other, and the economic always wins. You know, we sort of separate them, but the truth is that the patternings that exist in the world are in that instance social ecological. So the climate change is a social ecological pattern. The way humans interact with the ecology, chop the trees down, you know, put carbon into the atmosphere, changes the environment. The patternings both in the local wood, you know, with the slurry from the pig farm next door, are affected by human behaviour. So I don't see it as different. I see them as not just interwoven in terms of being coupled, as two things interacting, but as growing up, as emerging from the bottom up, in the same way as inner and outer. So you know, I hope that I do see them the same. I think that the same thinking applies to them, and I think that they're not distinct. So I'm not sure you'll agree with me, but I hope that gives you my perspective on your question.
Great. I think we have Chris Allen has got a question next.
Thanks, Anton. Hi, Jean.
Hi.
I find it enlightening as a physical science lecturer, and also somebody who's a PhD candidate in a very, shall we say, quantitative field in construction management, to hear you talk about this relationship between the, shall we say, the quantitative and the qualitative data, and making, so almost a challenge this puts into the physical sciences, because this is something that I've grappled with, shall we say, in the midst of the PhD, because of the environment in which I'm operating and the way that I've gone about the PhD, which is, shall we say, counterintuitive when a lot of academics are discussing it with me. So I suppose this idea that we have this transient state of being, which then doesn't really align to maybe that very physical state of the physical sciences, and how we deal with that within a reality and a real world environment. I suppose it's a bit like the last question that was asked, but you know, I'm a planner in the space that I in essence exist in terms of construction. So you know, when we plan a project, we have a very, shall we say, systems thinking way of going about it. We're almost countering that argument by saying that, well, it doesn't matter what we plan, which is a lot of the time is true. Something is going to impact on that, and therefore we are always in a transient state of mind. I'm just, how do we take, you know, some of this theoretical thinking and make it real, shall we say, in each of our disciplinary areas?
So if I was planning a construction, that I would regard that as a complicated as opposed to a complex problem in the main. I would do, you know, I would do exactly what you're doing. I would properly, quantitatively plan it in a very concrete way, and what this kind of complexity perspective might add to that is, you know, it will inevitably not go to plan, and there'll be some things that you haven't thought of, and you'll have to have contingency to deal with it. But it is essentially a complicated problem that accords with, you know, basic mechanics and the laws, you know, that are applied to construction. So I'm happy with that. What I'm trying to partly suggest in the more metaphysical aspects of this is that it's physics itself that tells you that things cannot be predictable in their entirety, that we have aspects of physics theories that can't talk to each other properly, that there's an indeterminacy that lies within the field of physics in general, where thermodynamics and quantum physics kind of bring in a form of a different form, but related forms of indeterminacy. The bits don't join up, so that our view that the world generally can be dealt with as if it's a complicated problem is what I'm questioning. So what I think it brings into policymakers, for example, in more open social situations, if I'm trying to develop a policy or strategy for an organization, is I would be quantitative. I am quantitative. You know, it's I would do all the things that you would do in the most professional way I could, but I would also, in my strategy, be looking wider than the traditional focus. So, for example, you know, the pandemic was not an unknown. It was known by, it was predicted, not when, but if, but it was not in the thinking of the economists. It's been the biggest thing that's happened to the economy in a long time. So one question is, can we think wider? Can we gather information wider and more systemically that might, say, affect our strategy? And can we perhaps try things out and see? So not just fix everything. Can we have more experiments? Can we have more of a portfolio approach? Can we review more often? Can we look at qualitative, subjective, emergent information? So it's a both and. It's do the things you're doing, but if you do it with a complexity mindset, you'll review more often, you'll take in wider data, you'll manage by walking about, you'll listen to people when they're starting to tell you that something's not quite working, or indeed sometimes that things are working better than you can possibly have imagined. So that's what I'm really trying to say. It's not throwing away, but just what has really interested me about this, being a physicist, but drawn to metaphysics and philosophy, is that physics trips itself up itself. It is only people who want to take the mechanical, materialistic view of physics and apply that as a theory of everything, that perhaps I think the seeds of its own disaster for that kind of physics are embedded within it, as many physicists are saying. It's not a new thought. So I hope that helps, Chris. Thank you for the question.
Great. Are there any other questions, comments? Well, in that case, I think we'll close off today's session. Jean, this has been incredible, very informative. Certainly learned a great deal. There's many ideas that I'll be incorporating into my own PhD methodology section. So thank you for that. It will be most certainly referenced. Andrea, any final words?
No, just thank you very much. I mean, I'm very interested to know about how it will change my self-conception to think of myself as a pattern and not a mind in a body. So I'm very, very interested in the kind of the details of what that would mean. But yeah, it's something for, you know, a longer reflection. So I'm very happy to end on that note. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'm really hoping that we will be able to continue this discussion in different formats, in different forums. Obviously, we've got a whole series now of talks planned for the rest of the year. But beyond that, I'm very interested to take this into a text of some sort. So I hope that will happen. We'll see what I can do to make it happen. Yes, so thank you very much. And what I would like, if you don't mind, is just to show your face. It would be very lovely to see some people rather than names, some faces, just before we sign off. Hi, Janet.
Thanks, Andrea. That was a great session.
Yes. No, don't thank me. Thank Jean for that one. Hi, Daniel. Hi, Rika. Good to see you too. All right. Sharon. Hi. Good to see you. Looking forward to a talk from Sharon on language and complexity. All right, Chris. Hi. Oh, lovely ceiling. Beautiful construction there. Okay, thank you all for joining us. And yes, next week we will be talking about ideology and yeah, conspiracy theories and the complexity of that stuff with Chris Alsobrook. So yes, hopefully we will see you all next week. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye, Andrew.
Great weekend.
Bye, Janet.
Bye.